Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. My name is Alex Weiser. I'm the Director of Public Programs of YIVO. And we're so pleased to have you here with us today for The Making of a Historian of East European Jewry and the Holocaust, Lucy S. Dawidowicz, and the YIVO in Vilna, New York, and Offenbach, with Professor Nancy Sinkoff. For those that don't know, YIVO is a very, very special place for the celebration and contemplation of Jewish history and Jewish culture. We have a library and archive with over 24 million documents and over 400,000 books, which researchers from around the world use. We bring these collections to life through public programs like this and classes and exhibitions and much more. So thank you so much for joining us. And today's talk is a part of our centennial celebration. YIVO was founded in 1925, 100 years ago. And so we're doing a whole series of events that explore YIVO's history and its contributions to Jewish studies and to Yiddish studies. And so today is a very important part of that, delving into Lucy Dawidowicz. And for that, we could have no one better than Professor Nancy Sinkoff, the academic director of the Alan and Joan Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life and professor of Jewish Studies and History at Rutgers University. She's author and editor of a number of books, including Out of the Shtetl, Making Jews Modern in the Polish Borderlands, From Left to Right, Lucy S. Dawidowicz, The New York Intellectuals and the Politics of Jewish History, and Polish Jewish Culture Beyond the Capital, Centering the Periphery. Nancy has long been associated with the YIVO Institute and contributed the entry Chaim Ginninger's Aspirantur briefcase for our centennial volume, 100 Objects from the Archives of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, which is available for pre-order from our store. It's going to be out next month. It's a really, really wonderful coffee table book highlighting 100 different objects from our collections with contributions from dozens and dozens of amazing scholars like Nancy Sinkoff. Nancy, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you all the back office staff at YIVO. I'm so delighted to be here. So I want to tell everyone the way this is going to proceed. The first thing that's going to happen is you're not going to listen to me. You're going to listen to excerpts of an audio broadcast. So I'm going to share my screen to make sure that you can hear the audio. And Alex, do me a favor, if there's a problem, just interrupt and tell me no one can hear. So that's what we're going to start with. And so listen up. And then I will explain better what you're listening to. So here we go. And thank you, everyone, for joining.
And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Command the children of Israel that they bring unto thee pure oil olive beaten for the light, to cause the lamps to burn continually in the tabernacle of the congregation. And it shall be a statute forever in your generations.
The Eternal Light. The National Broadcasting Company and its affiliated independent stations present The Eternal Light, a program which comes to you under the auspices of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. Our program today, The Golden Chain, was written by Judah Stamfer.
Well, that's it, Jerry. 1048 Fifth Avenue. Let's get those cartons unloaded.
This is a lot of merchandise, Steve, if it's for a store.
YIVO, Yiddish Scientific Institute. Some kind of library, I guess.
Well, let's get to work and start unloading.
So with the delivery of 420 cartons of books and papers, there ends a 7-year struggle for the rescue of the largest collection of Judaica in Hitler Europe, the Vilna collection of the Yiddish Scientific Institute. And so ends a journey that was a kind of resurrection, not of human beings, but of the spirit that animated them through the centuries, a journey begun back in 1940, just after the Soviets and Nazis partitioned Poland. The Second World War was getting underway, and the earth of Poland smelled of disaster like a hot Kansas cornfield just before the tornado strikes.
Zelig. Zelig Kalmanovich. Don't you recognize me? But of
course, Naphtali Feineman.
Yes.
So Jews still find their way to the Jerusalem of Lithuania in an unsettled hour.
Unsettled, to say the least. In America, we've been desperately worried.
Worried? Of what should a Jew be worried? We are old hands at weathering misfortunes.
To such misfortunes, may God deflect them. I don't know if we are too experienced.
It is in our power to do only so much. As for the rest... But what brings you to Vilna?
I came in the name of the American YIVO.
They are dear brothers. But they can hardly pluck us from between the hammer and the bear.
It is for the library and the archives we're concerned.
Yes. Over 100,000 volumes. First editions, manuscripts, town laws, responsa. So, the American YIVO is thinking of our library and archive.
Would God we could remove every child, every wagon driver, the very bodies from their graves. But at least, whatever happens, let our history not be blotted out.
Naphtali, how my spirits sway these days. You are right, of course. If the archives survive, I would find my own death lighter.
How long would their assembly and crating take?
5 weeks, maybe 4 if we hurry.
In that time, I'll try to arrange the papers we need. We will all have to hurry.
I am sure our advisory council will agree. As you say, we have no time to waste.
Naphtali Feineman to YIVO, New York. Vilna YIVO gives permission for removal of archives. Urge immediate contact State Department. Urgent, there be no delay. Urgent.
Okay, now I'm moving on to another section of this same broadcast. So listen up.
Stop! In the name of the SS. Halt! I require someone familiar with the YIVO library and archives.
Stay quiet, Zelig. Don't trust them. What's the difference? They will find me soon enough. I might be able to help the officer.
Who are you?
Zelig Kalmanovich, curator of the YIVO Vilna archives.
Dr. Sigmund Gotthard, advisor to Heinrich Himmler on Jewish question. You will take me to your archives building immediately. Get into my car.
Jude, herein.
So, these are your books, your records. Good. Excellent. Just what I have been looking for.
What is it you want with our archives? We harbor no munitions.
Who needs your munitions? It's your soul we want. That is my task. To capture the Jewish soul. And we have it here. In these rooms.
And what can you do with our soul, Dr. Gotthard, that you cannot do with your own?
Study it, analyze it, document it. Long after we burn your memories from German soil, your degenerate records in our museums will vindicate our policy. What are these?
Original manuscripts of Sholem Aleichem and Yud Lamed Peretz, two of our most distinguished writers.
How helpless they are in my Aryan hands. I hurl them to the ground. I trample them underfoot.
You have a powerful foot, Dr. Gotthard, have you not?
Enough. These archives will be sealed off until sent for. In this room, we have the mummified Jewish soul in thousands upon thousands of books and manuscripts.
And now for the last section of this golden chain that I'm going to share with you.
1945, the following message was sent. Yiddish Scientific Institute, New York. In answer to your inquiry, a large cache of Judaic material, estimated to number in the tens of thousands of volumes, has been found in a pit near Frankfurt. More in the cellar of the Nazi Institute for Jewish Knowledge in Frankfurt.
How does the situation stand, Saul?
Ticklish, Max. Those are the Vilna archives. and the State Department is backing our claim. But the Army wants to return all cultural treasures to their territorial origin.
Did our dead colleagues pass the very soul of their community through a wall of fire, only to have it held back by a wall of red tape? No. No, Saul. This we'll fight.
So for 2 years, YIVO carried its claim from agency to department, from department to board, from board to committee, from committee to conference, until finally, in June 1947...
Dr. Frank Peters.
Yes?
I'm Captain Seymour Pomerantz of the YIVO, the Yiddish Scientific Institute.
Oh, yes. What can I do for you?
I understand the Library of Congress is sending a representative to bring back American cultural treasures.
That is correct.
The YIVO also has a cache of archives there.
Yes, but haven't territorial claims been put upon them?
But, sir, those claims would wipe out every trace of meaning in the deaths of those who died to preserve them. We Jews are a unique people. The chain of our tradition is not embedded in the soil of Poland or Lithuania, but in our history.
I fully appreciate the unique character of your history, Captain Pomerantz, but how can I help you?
Well, Dr. Peters, American headquarters has recognized our legal claim to this treasure. We are an American organization. These are within the scope of your mission, like those treasures you're going to Europe to bring back.
I see.
Cut through the red tape, Dr. Peters. Bring them back as part of your mission.
You will have my every cooperation.
Thank you, sir. Let it be with all possible speed. We will know how to treasure that legacy.
Your authorization will be made out immediately.
Okay, so I hope you were able to hear well, and I also hope that you heard some of the issues at stake here in the restitution of Vilna's materials by YIVO after the war. And I'm going to now tell you about how this happened and to highlight the role of a young woman named Lucy Schildkret, who later would be known by her married name, Lucy S. Dawidowicz. I hope you see too on this slide the various people in the script. Some of them are real people like Naftali Feinerman, Zeli Kalmanovich, Avram Sutzkevel, Sol Liptzin, Ringelblum. I didn't put Max Weinreich, I should have. Max Weinreich, the director of YIVO, with whom Lucy worked extremely closely. Max Weinreich oversaw the writing of the script, The Golden Chain, for the Eternal Light series, which was out of JTS, was part of faith-based radio in those years. That's a very interesting topic in terms of the cultural Cold War, having public faith-based broadcasts. And he actually, we have the script in the YIVO archives, and he actually, edited out certain things. So for example, he took out the name of the murdered YIVO activist, Zalman Reisen. He had been murdered in 1941, and he corrected it. But interestingly, he did not see fit, for whatever reasons, in 1960, to mention the name of the YIVO activist, the volunteer, who tirelessly cataloged the 162,683 Yiddish and Hebrew volumes, identifying 32,894 of them, which were included in the 420 boxes shipped to New York in June of 1947. And that YIVO activist was Lucy Schildkret, later Lucy Dawidowicz. So today we're going to revisit the tremulous post-war years in Europe and restore her role on behalf of the restitution of Jewish cultural treasures. And what I want to emphasize here is that her deep connection with YIVO, already as a young woman, and then later working for Weinreich, as we'll see, in New York, and then later helping YIVO in the post-war years when she went back to Germany, informed what she later did as an historian of the Jews of Eastern Europe. So that is what I'm going to outline for you here. But let's start with her beginnings. Lucy Schildkret was born in 1915 in New York City to what we might call a typical immigrant family. Her family hailed from Poland. She was a second-generation immigrant daughter. Her father came from Warsaw. Her mother came from outside of Warsaw, from Siedlce. And both of them, therefore, were immigrants and Yiddish speakers. But she was the American born daughter. She lived in the Bronx. She was educated in New York City's public schools, and she attended the prestigious Hunter High School for Girls, as well as what was then the single-sex Hunter College. But at the same time that she was educated in American public institutions, her parents were committed to Yiddish and therefore sent her to a Yiddish afternoon school, a supplementary Yiddish school, and she attended the Sholem Aleichem Folk Institute. Some of you may know that there were 4 Yiddish school movements, secular Yiddish school movements in post-World War I New York, and some of them were quite politically affiliated. So the Arbeiter Ring was affiliated with the socialist movement. The International Arbeiter Olden, those shulas were affiliated with the Communist Party. There was actually a Zionist Yiddishist movement, the Falban, that has schools. The Sholem Aleichem Folks Institute was nonpartisan, that it sought to cultivate Yiddishism and the ideology of diaspora nationalism. And diaspora nationalism, of course, has a long history, but to sum it up, it is a commitment to Jewish life and the Jewish people in the diaspora. And it was shaped by the ideology of Shimon Dubnov, great Russian Jewish historian, and also shaped by the Jewish labor movement by the General Jewish Workers' Bund, Labor Bund of Russia and Poland. And the fundamental linguistic commitment was to Yiddish, the idea that Yiddish was a national language of the Jewish people and would help actually cultivate national belonging, even in the United States. That proved to be much more challenging. But in Europe, in the imperial context, and of course in post-war reconstituted Poland, where you had multiple ethnic groups speaking lots of different languages, despite their national fealty or patriotism to the new Poland, it made sense. And there were many, many Yiddish schools in interwar Poland. So the Sholem Aleichem Folk Institute in New York mirrored in many ways the Yiddishist activism of their friends, colleagues, and many family members back in Poland. And Lucy went to the Sholem Aleichem Folk Institute. This was after school. She went twice a week during the week, and then they went on Saturdays. And she was very, very devoted to it. She participated in the youth organization. She was an editor of their magazine called Schrift. And this also meant that she had contact with educators who were Yiddishists, some of whom were immigrants themselves. And most importantly, she was very close to someone said Yankov Shatsky, who was an extremely important YIVO activist and Polish Jewish historian. When she graduated from Hunter College with a degree in English, she wasn't really sure what to do. That won't surprise all of us even then, even though it's great to study the humanities, there's always a challenge. And she also had kind of shifted her engagement. She really wanted to be more involved with Yiddish culture and Jewish diasporic culture. She wrote in her later published memoir that even though she enrolled at Columbia University's master's program in English literature, that, quote, Keats and Wordsworth no longer interested me. So Yankov Shatsky encouraged her to study Jewish history, and she started to do that kind of somewhat informally by spending time at the great New York Public Library at the Dorot Division. I'm actually not 100% sure if it was then named the Dorot Division, but it always had and still has a great Judaica collection. And she started working informally on some kind of thesis on the Yiddish press in England. And Shatsky then said to her, if you really want to be immersed in Yiddish culture, if you really want to be at home, sort of among other Yiddishist scholars, you should apply for the aspirantur. And the aspirantur was a kind of graduate fellowship program associated with the Vilna YIVO. And the idea was that the YIVO would train the next generation of scholars of East European culture, literature, ethnography, philology, etc. And it was be done in Vilna, which was, as many of you know, home to a great rabbinic tradition and also home to a great secular literary tradition, and with fantastic archives and libraries. And the goal of the aspirantur, again, was to train the next generation of scholars, and they would pursue research projects, they would participate in seminars, they would improve their Yiddish, and they would also help out in the YIVO archives. So Lucy applied to the program in the winter of 1938, and she was accepted, and she sailed to Vilna, Poland that summer. And here you see an article in the Jewish Daily, in the Fallwelt, the Yiddish paper, with her Hunter College graduation picture on my left. I think it must be your left too. And the right, her colleagues, the aspiranteur, and I'll be able to show you them in a second. So at the YIVO, she was involved with her peer group, with scholars. She was living in the dynamic world of a transnational secular Yiddish culture. She befriended Zelig and his wife, Riva Kalmanovich. They became extremely important to her. And you heard Zelig Kalmanovich's name mentioned in the Eternal Light broadcast. She worked very closely with Max Weinreich, because at that point, of course, he was the director of the Vilna YIVO. Like other graduate fellows, she did the kind of things that graduate students did as well. She went to theater, she went to music, she discovered the countryside, she went to pubs, she chased young men, they chased her. And she also pursued her thesis on the Anglo-Yiddish press. And she became quite indispensable to Weinreich because of her bilingual language skills. He himself had been to the United States, but nonetheless, he relied on her very heavily. She actually considered doing a second year at the YIVO. She had done her thesis topic, as I said, on the Yiddish press. Here you have the list of the aspiranteur topics, and you'll see that I've outlined, or at least put an arrow to her name, Liebe Schildkret, New York, Yiddische Presse in England. And this is again from the YIVO archives today at the Center for Jewish History. So she thought about staying a second year. Weinreich very much wanted her to. And as a little bit of a sidebar, I want us to think about what that meant. We're talking about the summer of 1939, where a young American woman is thinking of staying yet another year in Eastern Europe. And I emphasize this because it highlights, or should highlight for us, that what we know now about what happened in that horrifying time between 39 and 45, that the Jews on the ground did not know. They did not know, just like we don't really know what's going to happen tomorrow. Obviously, the drums of war were beating, but the war had not yet started. But on August 27th, 1939, the Hitler-Stalin Pact was signed, this pact of non-aggression, and this would lead to the division of Poland, and it would also lead to the fact that the Soviet Union, which had the strongest army in Europe that could possibly contest the Wehrmacht, was now out of the picture. So even though she was considering staying in Poland, her beloved friends and mentors, Rivola and Zelig Kalmanovich, really said to her, you need to go home. You don't know what war is like. You have a passport, you can go. And so with enormous grief at leaving them behind, Schildkret fled. She traveled from Vilna to Warsaw, and then through Nazi Germany to Copenhagen, and finally to New York, saying goodbye to these people, among others. These is her cohort of the Aspiranten in February of 1939. She arrived back in New York in September, and after a brief sort of job with no real significance in Albany, she ended up working for Max Weinreich in the very small, almost skeletal YIVO. He too had gotten out. He had been en route to Brussels for an international linguistics conference. So when the war broke out, he was able himself to get to Copenhagen, and he was also able to be reunited with his family. And he then came, when he was in New York, he worked with what was called the Amuptel, the Amerikanel Optel, the American branch of the YIVO. And in the Golden Chains audio, you heard some of that back and forth with Naftali Feinerman and Zelig Kalmanovich. And you should know that this was very challenging. Even though there were YIVO branches established outside of Vilna, the one in Vilna was really the central home of the YIVO. And there was some reluctance at transferring the authority to the Uptel. But Weinreich, not so much he saw the writing on the wall, but he felt, that he was now living in America, and the Uptel should really take over. There was some contestation about it. But Lucy is there. She's working with him as his secretary, and she's getting to know many of the refugee scholars who were at YIVO in those years. They kept the YIVO going. They maintained the Institute's research agenda, conference agenda, and publication agendas. And they were aware, because of their ties back to Eastern Europe and because of their language fluency, they were aware in much starker ways about what was going on now in German-occupied Poland and, of course, in Soviet-occupied Eastern Poland. As YIVO's director, Weinreich was incredibly concerned with the fate of YIVO's scholarly holdings because he knew about the Nazi desire to destroy not only the Jews as human beings, but also to destroy their culture, that there was a very carefully orchestrated campaign to destroy Jewish cultural treasures, synagogue artifacts, books, libraries, etc. And this was run by someone named Alfred Rosenberg, who established in 1944 the Einsatzreichsleiter Rosenberg, the Reichsleiter Rosenberg Task Force, or the ERR, to pillage European Judaica collections. And by 1942, Rosenberg had set up offices throughout Europe and proceeded to loot them. And he spread his net to include 375 archives, 957 libraries, 531 research and educational institutes, and 402 museums in Eastern Europe alone. If you've never seen the long documentary, The Rape of Europa, I urge you to do so. You can also read the book, and that gives you a sense of what they wanted to do. At Rosenberg's side in the plunder of Judaica was someone named Dr. Johannes Pohl, and he was an expert in Hebrew literature. And he was devoted to the concept of Judenforschung ohne Juden, that is Jewish studies without Jews. And he oversaw the collection and shipment of Vilna's Valuable Judaica to Rosenberg's Institute in Frankfurt. So that is the situation. Weinreich is New York. He is very aware of what's happening. He is desperately concerned with how to protect Vilna's collections and YIVO's collections in particular. And he's concerned when the Germans are occupying the region, but then he is going to be even more concerned or equally concerned after the Stalin-Hitler Pact is broken during Operation Barbarossa, when the Germans break through Soviet-occupied Poland. Of course, they murder, we think, something like 1 million and 1.5 million Jews in their wake in the Einsatzgruppe and the mobile killing squads, but they also then the Germans and the Soviets are going to, battle over some of these library materials. Already in June of 1942, Weinreich had written to legal advisors in the U.S. State Department's Division of Cultural Relations in order to put on record with the U.S. government that the German occupying forces had, quote, carried away everything from the building of the Yiddish Scientific Institute at 18 Wilwowski Street in Vilna, in anticipation with the hope of some kind of future restitution. We now know that everything wasn't carried away. Some of you must be aware that the YIVO has digitized hundreds of documents in Lithuania that were only discovered, more recently. But the Germans certainly did grab a lot of material. So Schildkret becomes, as we'll see, fundamental to the cataloging of the materials in Europe. So what happens is that she is working with Weinreich as his secretary. And I think it's important to realize now, especially many of us who don't have secretaries, is that back in the day, secretaries knew everything because they were the one doing the typing. They were the one answering the phones. They were privy to all of the internal memos that their bosses were writing. So she, on the ground working for Weinreich, knows everything he's doing. And he is contacting everyone in the State Department, at the Library of Congress, YIVO activists with financial pull, rabbis. He is doing everything to try and set the stage for what he hopes will be a claim about YIVO being the rightful heir of whatever has been plundered in Vilna. And she also wrote on her own, because at one point he took a leave of absence to write his extremely important book, Hitler's Professors, the Part of Scholarship in Germany's Crimes Against the Jewish People. So she was working on her own, corresponding with people about the fate of Vilna's archives. The first evidence that some part of YIVO's library might still exist came on June 20th, 1945, in a cable from Captain Aharon Aharoni, who was a YIVO activist, and he wrote to his wife Celia saying that he had chanced upon some of the books that had YIVO's stamp. And a month later, General Lucius Clay, commander of U.S. forces in Germany, informed the U.S. War Department of the discovery of books with YIVO's ex libris stamp. And all of this is going to get to Weinreich, and he's going to start working even harder on making a claim for these materials. He knew that the restoration of Jewish cultural property would be a thorny one, compounded not only by the complex structure of post-war German occupation and international law. This gives you a sense. You may know that post-war, the post-war landscape, there were 4 occupying states in Germany. There was a British zone, an American zone, a French zone, and then a Soviet zone. And all of these different powers competed with one another over all kinds of things. But the American zone was extremely large, and that is where Frankfurt was located. And so that is where what we will encounter, the Offenbach Archival Depot, that is where the books, the Vilna materials were. So Weinreich had really to convince the Americans that it was in their interest, and now that America controlled this area, that in fact, these materials rightfully belonged in America. Another problem he had, and you may have heard this in the audio, is that the general, and again, I'm not a legal scholar, but the principle of restitution is that materials plundered during wartime should go back to the nations from which they were taken. So what do you do with Jewish cultural property that has been plundered in a variety of places, not only in Eastern Europe, but because the Nazis collected all this stuff? To whom does it return? Should it be returned? Should a prayer book or should a Yiddish translation of, Goethe go back to Germany or should it go back to France, or should it go back to Lithuania? And Weinreich made the claim, and this is extremely interesting, that the stateless people of Jews, the Jews not having a state, not having a sovereign territory, nonetheless were a nation of people and had a rightful claim to these objects, and objects including religious objects, artistic objects, and of course all the library and archival material. So I give you this because this is extremely interesting, and to think about, the world we live in today, who speaks for the stateless? And I'm just leave that for you to think about. I don't have answers for any of these things, but I can tell you that Weinreich was extremely strategic, and he had a vision, and he was adamant and obstinate. He knew that more than 90% of Polish Jewry had been murdered, and therefore there was no one to whom to return the materials. So this was his tactic, and he pursued it relentlessly, as I said, between 1945 and 1947. He was supposed to go to Europe to look at the materials and to figure out what to do with them, but he never made the trip. Instead, Lucy Schildkret, who was the link between pre-war Vilna and the New York City YIVO, ultimately acted in his stead. In the late spring of 1946, she had decided to return to Europe. She would be working for the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee as an educational officer in the DP camps. And here is the letter of her appointment. and her photograph, and you see it says Lucy Ruth Schildkret. She looks more grown up from her Hunter College graduation. She already looks like a mature woman. And she was stationed in Munich, the JDC's headquarters for the American Zone of Occupation. And her job was to procure supplies for the DP camps' educational institutions, which included 60 schools, theater materials, art materials, etc. And she soon found herself involved with the haunting work of restituting the libraries and archives of YIVO. She arrived at the Offenbach archival. Sorry. I want to just take a step back. I didn't see this. I didn't anticipate this slide. I'm sorry about that. In the American and British zones of occupied post-war Germany, she did a number of things. On the upper left, you see a very important journal, von Letzenholven. She helped get the Yiddish linotype for this. This is one of the first journals written by DPs, collecting testimonies and other evidence of the destruction of European Jewry. This is out of the DP camps. There you see the Dramatic Club. Lucy is second to the right on the bottom, and that was in the British zone. And then you see her in Belsen in 1947 above the sign of the American Joint Distribution Committee. So she worked in both the American zone and the British zone. And in the British zone, she experienced the very activist Zionist movements there. And she discusses it in her memoir, and I can tell you more about that if you're interested. But going back to the depot, this is what the Offenbach archival depot looked like. This represents some of the millions of Jewish books that were shredded by the Germans. They also sent many, many things just to paper shredders. And she arrived there in 1947 as the official representative of the Joint Distribution Committee with the authority to take books, manuscripts, or objects from the depot for the DP schools. So, for example, if she found a run of children's books, she was allowed to borrow them so that the schools in the DP camps would have textbook materials. So she was given that permission. She had that authority. But in the process, she is going to be able simultaneously to work on documenting which books were from Vilna. Now, her job at the depot was complicated for a whole host of reasons. One of them was that her predecessors had been, how shall I say, a little creative with what materials they took out of the depot. This is a very interesting story involving people like Hugo Bergman, Gershom Scholem, Koppel Pinson, because there were some very valuable manuscripts that were plundered. And when Scholem, for example, who represented the Hebrew University and coming from, post-war Palestine, he realized how valuable some of these manuscripts were, and he made sure they were sent. He collected them, got them out of the depot, got them out of occupied Germany, and got them to the University Library in Jerusalem, where they still are. And so, and Koppel Pinson may have actually created his own personal library. So Lucy Schildkret was, she really had to follow the rules and to borrow the things for the JDC, but simultaneously she knew from Weinreich that there were YIVO materials there and that she should document them, which is exactly what she did. And Weinreich felt strongly that YIVO was the rightful heir of the magisterial collections of all of Vilna. And he wanted to make sure that not only did she catalog things with YIVO's ex libris, that all the material that belonged to some of the very important archives in Vilna would make their way to New York. I think it's important to realize that this approach, we should be very sensitive to the fact that in 1947, no one thought there would be any future of a Jewish community in Europe, right? The Soviets controlled huge swaths of what had been Eastern Europe. We know that Avram Sutzkever and Shmerka Kaczyginski, two YIVO activists who had been involved in the paper brigade in Vilna. You should read David Fishman's book about the book smugglers. that they also despaired of what would happen to Jewish cultural treasures under the Soviets. So Max Weinreich made, in some ways, a really prescient decision that the more material that could be gotten out of occupied Germany and gotten safely to the United States was better. And that was Lucy's job, to catalog all of it. And this included, material from the Ansky Jewish Historiographic Society, the Library and Archives of Shimon Dubnov, personal papers of people like Rezel and Zeli Kalmanovich, part of the Jewish, the historical sections, materials that hadn't been brought by Cherikover. In short, to make as broad a claim as possible. And again, remember, this is, 1947. So indeed, in June of 1947, 420 boxes of books were shipped to YIVO after Schildkretz's tireless work. It didn't take only 5 weeks, it took 3 months. And she worked with Seymour Pomerantz, you heard his name in the audio. And Pomerantz was not only a YIVO activist, he was a member of the Library of Congress. So with Weinreich, the Library of Congress, and the US military, these books were shipped. And they arrived in YIVO in New York City in July of 1947. And here you see YIVO personnel opening up the boxes. And Lucy describes this in her memoir. There were many emotional moments when they opened these boxes. You can only imagine. They found books with the signatures of some of their murdered activist comrades and friends. Weinreich found some things from his own collection when he was there. They were holding, in many ways, the people whom they loved and also the ghosts, their ghosts. So this was her great contribution in getting these materials cataloged so they could be shipped to New York. Now, Weinreich, you heard in The Eternal Light, didn't really highlight her role. Later on in the news from the YIVO, there was an article that briefly mentioned some of the personalities, but it was a little bit of an aside about her role. It really had to wait until she wrote her memoir in 1989, From That Place in Time, a memoir about her role in cataloging the YIVO archive. But clearly, when we look at then the future trajectory of her career as an historian of Eastern Europe, these years, the years of diaspora nationalist education in New York, being at the Vilna YIVO, working at the New York City YIVO so closely with Weinreich, and then going back to Europe to work, with the JDC, meet the refugees in the DP camps, and to work in the Offenbach archival depot, absolutely informed her life. When she returned to the United States in 1947, she married, and that is where she got her Polish last name. She married Szymon Dawidowicz, himself someone who worked at YIVO as a copy editor. He was a Warsaw native. He was a Yiddishist and a Bundist. He had arrived in the United States earlier, and his first family perished in the Warsaw Ghetto. And poignantly, upon all the poignant stories, his daughter Topcha was a ghetto fighter, and during the ghetto uprising at the bitter end in 1943, she was in the sewers with her comrades, and she sprained her ankle or hurt her foot, and she could not escape from the sewers. And when he found out that she died, when Szymon found out, he was devastated, absolutely devastated. And they kept a picture, he and Lucy kept a picture of Topcha in their house, throughout their lives together. It would take about 20 more years for Dawidowicz to become a public figure, an historian associated with the fate of the Jews of Europe, because from 1949 to 1969, she worked at the American Jewish Committee. And I can tell you more about that. You can read about it in my book, that section I call Becoming an American. But in 1969, she left working for the committee, in part because she had been doing work creating an anthology of East European Jewish culture through autobiographical, or what we now call ego documents. And she had published a book called The Golden Tradition. So let me show you this. That's the first edition of the Golden Tradition. And you can see what her method was, or what her ethos was. Eastern Europe was the cradle of almost every important Jewish cultural, religious, and national movement, and the area where Jewish faith, thought, and culture flourished unsurpassed. In anthologizing these texts, I was guided by the desire to show the diversity of Jews and their culture, the centripetal and centrifugal forces that moved them, and the variety they brought to Jewish thought and life. East European Jewry was not, as the sentimentalists see it, forever frozen in utter piety and utter poverty. So you can see that her commitment to diaspora nationalism, her commitment to telling Jewish history through the sources of the Jews themselves, her commitment to the vitality of Eastern European Jewry, of Yiddishism, of the variety of politics, culture, and even gender. I mean, she's one of the first people to anthologize some women's writings, which, most people weren't doing. This is 1967. And this book really, it's still in print, by the way, with a long introduction. It's really in many ways, a manifesto of diaspora nationalism. It's a manifesto of her commitments to YIVO's aspirantor program. And it's a manifesto to what another activist with whom she tangled, actually, Philip Friedman, dubbed Goldenforschung, which is to write about the catastrophe, the destruction of the Jews of Europe, but to write it from their perspective. That is, that the victims should have a voice, they have agency. And this perspective shaped all of her writing. And in many ways, it was a response to the historiography on the destruction until that time, most of which focused on either Nazi ideology or the military industrial killing machines. And I want to say that she had great respect for Raoul Hilberg, who wrote, this extraordinary book. He went through millions, I think millions of documents or something crazy like that, to document how the killing happened. But that's what's called perpetrator history. And she felt strongly that what had to be told was the history from the Jews themselves. And so that's all of her bibliography, and these are her books: The Golden Tradition, A Holocaust Reader, then a famous book, The War Against the Jews, which really put her on the map in another way, collection of her essays, The Jewish Presence, The Holocaust and the Historians, and then her memoir. All of these books are devoted to the memory of the culture of East European Jews. And here you see the various dedications in her bibliography. To the Golden Tradition, she dedicated 2 Zelig and Riva Kalmanovich, 2 of 6 million. The War Against the Jews, she dedicated to Shimon's children, Topcha and Zurich. A Holocaust Reader, in memory of the 6 million, and she cited Zelig Kalmanovich's diary. The Jewish Presence, to her husband, Shimon Dawidowicz, who was ill and then would die. The Holocaust and the Historians, in memory of the murdered Jewish historians of Eastern Europe. I'm adding the Eastern Europe part, but just so you know, Shimon Dubnov, Meir Balaban, Ignacy Schipper, and Emanuel Ringelblum, the head of the Einik Shabbos Underground Archive in the Warsaw Ghetto. On Equal Terms was her book on America, from a long essay that she published in the American Jewish Yearbook. There's no dedication there. She had hoped to write a master study of American Jewry. She never did it, but there's no dedication there. That represents in some ways the future. And then in 1989, she published her extraordinary memoir, From That Place and Time, 1938 to 1947, and in memory of the murdered Jews of Vilna. And in it, she has the Hebrew inscription, Ele Eska, these we will remember. So this gives you, again, a sense of how her life experiences, diaspora nationalism, the YIVO, the efforts to restitute Jewish cultural property, made her primed to tell the story of what had happened in what we now call the Holocaust, then was called the murder of the 6 million, or in Yiddish, the Holden, to tell it as a way of commemorating the culture and the people. And for her, she really felt that in some ways, the bias about resistance to the murderous machine, and also the survivor testimonies that became part and parcel of many, many efforts. For Dawidowicz, the story of the Holocaust was the destruction of East European Jewish culture. Of course, there were survivors, and many of them were, their stories should be told. She wasn't against that, but she felt that many people were skewed in thinking, in a very sort of false optimistic way, that the culture had survived because some people had survived, or that people survived because they had resisted, they had put guns on their back. And what she and many other East Europeans of her sentiment felt, including Marek Edelman, by the way, who was the leader, the last commander of the Żydowska Organizacja Bojonowa in the Warsaw Ghetto. They believed that there was as much dignity in living through the horrors, even walking to the Umschlagplatz, as there was in putting a gun on in your shoulder. That there wasn't more heroism if you fought back militarily than if you just tried to survive. And that was extremely important to her, and again, to Edelman as well, because what was important to her was the culture. And that had been, if not totally destroyed, had been certainly geographically decimated, because the 1,000-year history of Jews in Polish lands and what became Russian lands and Austrian Galician lands and Posen lands, and the culture of Yiddish 1,000 years was in fact destroyed. So this was her ethos, and this is what shaped her. The golden tradition, as I said, put her on the map, and she left the committee and taught one of the first courses on the Holocaust at Stern College for Women as part of Yeshiva University. She was invited to do so by David Mirsky. And again, this is a story unto itself, but this is the first page of the syllabus. And you will see here, and I'm happy to address your questions about this. For Dawidowicz, you could not understand the Holocaust or the destruction unless you understood the power of anti-Semitism. And this was a direct rebuttal to a certain historiographic tradition in the late 60s and early 70s that emphasized the structural reasons for the destruction. Some of that was Marxist, sort of class structure. Some of it was, sort of what was called a functionalist approach, that there were various bureaucracies and the fight with the Soviet Union and then the success of Operation Barbarossa, that's really what led to the destruction of the Jews. Certainly, they would say Barbarossa and the killing squads, the Jews were in the way. But for Dawidowicz, the issue was the ideology of anti-Semitism. And so for her, there could not have been the destruction of the Jews of Europe, the Holocaust, without Hitler. And therefore, that is how she teaches. And you'll see the course outline starts with Mein Kampf and goes to the Wannsee Conference. So again, that was very much a part of her ethos. So I have many more things to say, but I am mindful of the time. So I'm going to wrap up here, and I'm, of course, happy to take your questions. I will just add that all of her historiography, everything she did, was both commemorative and what she hoped would be nation building. That if she could write a history that told of the vitality and dignity of the Jews of Eastern Europe, that she would give the next generations, even if they're reading in English, a sense of that vitality and creativity. And that would help sew together this now fragmented American diaspora. So she definitely was, quote unquote, lowercase, a nationalist historian. And in that regard, she is following in the footsteps, again, of someone like Dubnov and Ringelblum and Bauerban and others. So what have you learned here, I hope? That in 1938, a young working class American immigrant daughter of Polish Jewry sailed to Poland on a trip that would transform her life forever. In the fateful last year before the Nazi onslaught against European Jewry, which would result in the almost complete decimation of Polish Jewry, And on her post-war sojourn in the DP camps, Lucy Schildkrit acquired a European soul. And therefore, henceforth, she identified herself wholeheartedly with the history, culture, language of the Jews of Poland. And when she turned to writing history, as I said, she did it with the continuities of Dubnov, Friedman, and others about telling the story from the perspective of the Jews themselves. By a mixture of chance, intention, and fate, her most enduring role working for the JDC would be restituting the remnants of YIVO's library and the library and archives of the plundered institutions of Vilna. And she got them from the Offenbach archival depot and ensured their safe shipment to New York. And in doing so, Lucy Schildkrit, Lucy Dawidowicz, helped to establish the YIVO as a distinguished American Jewish research institution, and the New York YIVO as a critical institutional link to the East European Jewish past. So here she is at the very end of her life. And I think seeing her as a living link, and Max Weinreich did recognize this, between the Vilna YIVO and the American YIVO is central to who she was and the mission of her life. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this wonderful talk, Nancy. We have a lot of questions, so let's just jump into it for a few minutes. Just first, I was curious, the radio broadcast that you began with is an amazing document. Where can one listen to that?
Well, you know, the Eternal Light archives, you have them. I'm almost 100% sure that they're part of YIVO's collection, because I found it through a friend.
Okay.
Who said to me, "Do you know?" This was many years ago. "Do you know that there is an Eternal Light?" So I'm almost 100% sure they're part of YIVO's collection, but they're definitely at the center.
I'll go downstairs to my colleagues in the sound archives and ask them.
Yeah. And if you look at also in Professor Jeff Chandler's book, you know, While America Watches, he spends a lot of time on the broadcast, and they're incredible. I mean, and also that beginning, I mean, for you, like, who's the chazan? Who wrote that? What's that all about? You know, I don't have the answer. And that sort of Cecil B. DeMille stage, you know, thus spake the Lord. It's kind of incredible.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
I'm curious, do you know why Lucy went to work for the American Joint Distribution Committee? It seems like YIVO, I mean, especially from the perspective of YIVO today, but YIVO is really the place where the action is, and then her work, you know, takes her back to YIVO. But why did she leave? Do you know?
Well, you know, there's I think at some point I heard someone say, you know, Weinreich, you know, giving him all this power. Weinreich told her to do this. There's no smoking gun. I have no evidence to that effect. I think it was somewhat personal. I think that in some ways she had run her course working for Weinreich. You know, everyone who knew Lucy Dawidowicz said she was really difficult, and I'm sure it was difficult working for Weinreich. You know, this charismatic, all-encompassing, authoritative man. You know, we all know, right? And I think that she, in some ways, felt that she had run her course. There was discussion among Levi Schlerer, who was one of her mentors at the Shalom Lechem Folks Institute, extremely important. He's so worthy of a study. I'm not going to do it now, but I thought about it. He ran Camp Boibelik, which was this extraordinary Yiddishist camp, and he was a YIVO activist and on the board. And there is some correspondence between him and Weinreich about when she was about to come back, about whether or not she should come back to the YIVO. And there's a sense that the room wasn't big enough for her, her and other employees. Yeah. So I think there were some personal reasons, and, some things you can't, some people speculate. I'm not interested in speculating about, was there, what if there were personal things that made it really impossible. You can imagine where I'm going here, but I have no evidence. So yeah. So she went to Europe, and it was also, I think, she didn't write so much about the work. I have it archivally, but she didn't write publicly about it. so much. In fact, I misspoke a little bit. It's amazing in her memoir, she doesn't even mention the British zone. She was in the British zone of occupation when the ships from the Exodus were when the DPs from the Exodus were sent back from Haifa to occupied Germany. And her best friend was a woman named Pearl Ketcher, who was the medical director in Poppendorf. And Pearl then went to Palestine. And Lucy, I mean, there are 40 years of correspondence between these two women. Pearl was incredible. And her brother established the press office in Israel. But she never wrote about that, which is just amazing. But why did I mention that to you is that she, she really wanted to tell a particular kind of story. Yeah. Anyway.
Looking back to our relationship with YIVO at the time, I have a mentor who likes to repeat the phrase or share the adage that a tall oak casts a large shadow. And you can kind of imagine that for a big personality like Dawidowicz, being next to someone like Weinreich would not give her the room to grow. But it was really interesting that you pointed out that Lucy's role in the restitution process was kind of downplayed. And I wonder do you think that was intentional?
Well, I think there's several issues. So to be fair to some other scholarship, truly, Weinreich, I want to say this, but I think he did the right thing. So let me just say that. But Weinreich kind of pulled an end run a little bit around not only the State Department, but also Sailor Baron, right? So this story is so complicated and so interesting, right? It's particularly because then all the stuff was discovered much later, right? But Sailor Baron was charged to run Jewish Cultural Restoration, Inc., and with Hannah Arendt. Elizabeth Gallas's book is great on this. And a lot of people were running around that depot figuring out where the stuff should go. And Baron, under the auspices of the Americans, was sort of charged with this. And Weinreich knew, everyone knew Baron. And he didn't want these YIVO and Vilna's materials. He didn't want them going to JCR Inc. because he was afraid of what would happen to them. So he was able to argue not only that the Jews, a stateless people, had a right, but that YIVO had the right. And so they got their materials. YIVO got the materials before Baron does his work. And so I think he wanted to keep it on the down low a little bit. So, I don't think it was, also, I think by then, 1960, or when they wrote about it in Yedias, she had left. Also, she was a secretary to him. When she started out at the American Jewish Committee, she also started out as a secretary to Milton Himmelfarb. We have to remember those years. There were many bold women who set out and made extraordinary journalistic careers in those years, but she didn't, and she never had a doctorate, and she got her master's in 1963 with Baron, of course, writing about Lewis Marshall. And I think The Tall Oak is a very interesting thinking about that, because her husband, by all reports, was a gentle soul, Shimon Dawidowicz. And I think and they had a very loving marriage by, again, all accounts. He was 20 years older than she was, and he didn't cast that shadow. And she was able, and he supported her, and she was able to then do everything she did. But late in life,
Yeah.
by our standards today. So I don't think it was exactly intentional, but she really she didn't get the due that she should have gone. She's not in the broadcast. She's not.
Yeah. You kind of glossed over the American Jewish Committee becoming an American moment. Do you have any more you'd like to share about that?
Well, in terms of the book, it solved a problem for me. I was trying to think about the books. The subtitle is the title is From Left to Right. Lucy, the book on which all this material is based. Sorry, I should preface that. From Left to Right, Lucy Dawidowicz.
Your book. Just for the listeners. Yeah.
Lucy Dawidowicz, The New York Intellectuals and the Politics of Jewish History. And I was trying to ask this question: how does a left-wing, Yiddishist secularist become associated with the neoconservatives of the 80s, who now, by the way, seem really like charming, I have to say. But, I was trying to get at that question through her life, and the American Jewish Committee years, it was 2 decades, was fundamental. Because that is where she sort of made peace with quote unquote German Jewry, which is ridiculous to make that binary so stark, but this is someone who was reared in the secular, diaspora nationalist, Yiddishist immigrant milieu. She didn't really know the uptowners. She didn't know from Reform Judaism. She didn't know from a definition of Judaism as a confession or religion. And when she goes to the committee, she encounters people like this, and she encounters the committee itself, which was, established in 1906 and devoted to the separation of church and state and devoted to the idea that the Jews are a religion, not a nation. And Milton Himmelfarb was extremely important to her. And she just grew and kind of became much more American. And the kinds of things she worked on in the Research Institute also helped her become an American, because she worked on three main topics: anti-communism, what was then called Negro-Jewish relations and urbanism, and church and state issues. So just thinking about those topics, those are not really East European topics. I mean, the communism piece, yes, but it plays out so differently. Anti-communism and communism in Eastern Europe play out so differently than in the United States, which I like to remind people all the time, that living under the Soviets was no picnic, so that people should understand that when there were people who were anxious about communism in the United States, or were persecuted for it, that they had no idea what was going on in Eastern Europe. I mean, one of the best examples from a Yiddishist point of view was the murder of Reza. I mean, if you were a Jewish socialist under the communists, it was very bad. So working at the committee really meant encountering this different way of being a Jew and being an American Jew. And in the process, she had a rapprochement with Judaism. She began to think about that. She moved away from sort of this secularist position. Shimon never did. He was really a secularist, but let her do her thing. She became very close. I mentioned that to David Mirsky, who was a polymath, an extraordinary man, and he was the dean of Yeshiva College. And he was, just this incredible, broad intellectual and also an observant Jew. So I think she learned, there was a new world that opened up to her at the committee. And she also grew as a researcher. So they were very fundamental years. And it was, 2 decades of her life. So, yeah.
As you researched all of her work and in the archives, did you find anything that was any discrepancies between archival sources and what she wrote in her own memoirs? Anything that is interesting to reflect on?
I think it's, and I have to say, again, I'd like to give credit to some other people. I think that, again, the restitution of the books, she told the story in a certain way. Full stop. Because, again, and I try and get people to understand this, and I think also Lisa Leff's book is interesting on The Archive Thief. We have to take temporality seriously. What people thought and did in 1947 versus what we think now about provenance in a museum. If you go to museums in Germany, for example, today, and or this happened at the Jacob Lawrence show during COVID, I'll never forget it, because of that great pageant he did of American history. When there's a missing piece in a series, in today's the curatorial or museology, they'll say missing, lost these years. We don't know where. They want to give you, the viewer, a sense of where the collections came from, how they got there, and what's missing. But that's today. That was not museum practice. I mean, I don't think I need to tell you. That's why we have all these fights now about you have this and you have to give it back to this one. So I think that when she wrote the memoir, she was being protective, because thank goodness for them, we have these materials here. And what would have happened to them if they had remained, in the rubble of Germany? And look, we know this from the Ringelblum archive. I mean, that's a really good example. If Rachel Auerbach had not survived, and with Hirschwasser was able somehow to find in the rubble of Warsaw, those 7 caches, we'd have nothing. And we, of course, are missing 3. So the fact that Weinreich, tirelessly insisted on this, I think it was a heroic act, actually. But they didn't necessarily want to broadcast it. So I think that in that regard, the archival sources may tell more than what she wrote in her memoir. But I looked at those archives, and I tried to be honest in the book. I think I was honest.
Yeah, I will say I've read the State Department file on this story, and there are people who are skeptical of what Weinreich puts forward in at that time. That comes as no surprise to the people who know this story very well. But they were very fastidious about what they said, and they're the important claims are not really falsifiable, at least as far as I've encountered.
Yeah.
And so, there are people who believe that, Weinreich made white lies, or or darker, depending on your view of it, I suppose. But yeah, they were very careful about how they approached it.
Right. I mean, they talked YIVO and affiliated, but look, these are. I mean, this is. I'll give you a different example. I mean, Sholem stole those manuscripts. They're still.
Right.
He just stole them.
I haven't encountered anyone upset about that.
Right. No one's upset about that. But what they were upset about, I'll tell you a little bit, it's contemporary, but it's something, when they built the new Israel National Library and replaced it with the Jewish National University Library in Givat Ram. I mean, they're close to each other, but in the JNUL, the old one, there was a Sholem room with his stuff, right? His library. And there were big fights about what would happen in the new library, because once you take that collection and break it up, you no longer have the history of where it was. So I think, and that's true, that's historic loss. And I think the actual battle was won, that the Sholem, I mean, I visited only briefly, but that's the question of, can we tell the provenance of all these materials that get wrapped into the affiliated libraries? And I think if you can, then, then there's nothing to criticize Weinreich for. But people like to do that stuff.
It's a fascinating topic. We're running out of time, but maybe one more question. Someone's asking about the Ringelblum collection, and you spoke about how the role that she played in pioneering Grubenforschung, and also that one of her books was dedicated in part to Ringelblum. So maybe you could just talk a little bit more about that, and about how she saw the Ringelblum archive and wrote about it.
She only wrote about it. She has a very short review of 3 books on the Warsaw Ghetto. I think it was actually in the Menorah Journal, I think, or maybe in commentary. She didn't write a lot about Ringelblum. I think, she didn't really know Warsaw. She knew Vilna. And Warsaw was Shimon's turf. And Warsaw was the turf of agony and pain for him. So she didn't really write about Ringelblum, but his efforts, and the efforts to, again, protect the experience of Jews in life and in crisis and extremis. That she wanted to make sure their voices were heard. And in The War Against the Jews, she actually structures the whole book around this idea of community, which is so Dubnovian, the idea that there was an underground community and there was a, alternative community. So you see that the idea of the kahila or the kahal. So it's not really, I'm not really answering your question about Ringelblum, because I'm sort of scouring my files in my head here. I don't recall really so much attention to Ringelblum, but it is the idea that Jews live, and even when there is horrifying persecution, they maintain their sense of self, and that is that's going to be kind of the key. Whether or not history is the key to Jewish continuity, well, we can have a long conversation about that. But that is what she believed, that if the history were told the right way, and if you only tell the story of victimization, you don't give people anything real to hold on to. And I think she's right. I don't know if history will save anything, but I do think only to tell history through victimization is impoverishing, and it also denies the agency of the people who lived in real time.
I agree. I think that's really a YIVO ethos, and maybe that's the connection there. Ringelblum, Lucy, really drawing from the same wellspring.
Totally. Dubnov gave the opening lecture at the Aspirantur. Yeah, and Ringelblum came and gave lectures at the Aspirantur also. So she certainly knew about him, but Ringelblum was in Warsaw. And there's like sort of a historiographic competition between Vilna and Warsaw. And also YIVO, as you know, it did do history, but it was more devoted to philology and ethnography and things like this. And in Warsaw, there was sort of a historical school, partly because you had migrants from Galicia, including Bałwan and Chipre and others, who then went. Bałwan had taught at the University of Warsaw. So kind of that was like the historical Kreis was more there. So yeah, so there's competition between the two cities, but that's healthy.
Well, Nancy, thank you so much for this wonderful lecture.
Oh, my pleasure, really. I'm happy. And I will say that it underscores the riches of the YIVO archive. So I'm happy to announce that on its 100th anniversary. Happy birthday, YIVO.
Thank you so much.